I'm the dark side of your conference today. So we're going to talk about the underbelly of all this fragile splendor. And actually, that's what makes it fragile. I think, let's have the first slide. Prestige, power, and the peculiar institution of slavery. I want to point out two things at the outset. Unlike some of the subjects of this conference, Thomas Jefferson was not born into power or prestige. He was born in 1743. Here's an example of his power and prestige that he was not born into. He was born on that red dot. Those lines are the mountains. That is the frontier of the colony of Virginia. He's right on the frontier edge, where he's born in a rural hamlet. He was the son of a surveyor, a planter who married above his station, acquired a little more power there. He's really born into minor American aristocracy. But number two, he is born into a world that relied on slavery. And indeed, his first and last memories, separated by more than 8 decades, are of enslaved assistants helping him. So now I'm going to offer you 3 quotes, one about power, one about slavery, and one about prestige, and they're by or about Thomas Jefferson. Here's the quote about power. It's among the most famous and transformative sentences in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that's the most famous sentence. We all know who wrote it, but let's go on. Down on that 3rd line, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Jefferson was 33 years old when he wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence for the Continental Congress. I just quoted from the preamble, in which he invoked theories of the Enlightenment to radically alter the balance of power between the governed and the governor. A rebalance that replaced monarchy and the divine right of kings with the corporate will of the people. The populace would select their leaders and hold them accountable for their safety and happiness. The genius of Jefferson was that he took a divorce decree, a separation agreement. All it had to do was list the grievances. And really what the Declaration of Independence was for was so that we could come to Europe, not England, sorry guys. We could come to France and Amsterdam and borrow money because we had to fund this revolution. And nobody was going to give us money if we didn't write that document. The genius of Jefferson is he listed those complaints and added a universal Enlightenment concept. With Jefferson's preamble, it ceases to be a separation statement and it becomes the mission statement for the country. Abraham Lincoln may have most eloquently recognized Jefferson's overreach of power. All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. Half the nations on the planet quote or invoke some aspect of Jefferson's preamble in their governing documents today. That's power, the power of an idea. Jefferson did not gain power or influence through birth, wealth, maybe a little bit by marriage. His real power came from education, an Enlightenment belief in the power of knowledge and ideas. He ended the preamble to the Declaration with an introduction to the grievances. He wrote, "The present King of Great Britain has a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states," end of quote. Jefferson did like hyperbole a bit. And it's actually there that the Declaration of Independence actually begins with long list of injuries. Nobody reads that part today, but it's predictable: denial of justice, lack of representation, unfair taxation, imposition of troops, aggression, war, quartering a standing army, etc. But there is one grievance in Jefferson's first draft that the Continental Congress rejected outright. So quickly did it divide them. And here is Jefferson on slavery. "The present King of Great Britain has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither." This is Jefferson the abolitionist, seizing the power of the moment that he has to write the Declaration to try to end slavery by condemning it and blaming it on King George III, which of course is ridiculous. But one of the reasons he blames everything on King George III is because the Continental Congress didn't want to offend all of the British people, their brothers, so they figured, let's just offend the king and blame it on him. But the southern colonies insisted that Jefferson's tirade against slavery be removed. They were not in favor of ending the slave trade or slavery. And Jefferson was from one of those colonies, Virginia. So the founders were confronted with a choice: create a nation or fracture and fail over slavery. Now, you have to remember the stakes are kind of high at this point. If they don't get it together and unify, they're all traitors. They're going to hang. So they have a choice, and they let slavery go. Jefferson didn't give up. As we'll see, he continued to oppose slavery in his writings, but he backed away from being an abolitionist. For him, there was a far more important cause, and it became central to his life, and that, of course, was building the new nation. In his mind, the abolition of human bondage would have to wait. The nation was too fragile. It had first to be born, then built and strengthened before it could survive the turmoil over slavery. So the United States was born in 1776 with the adoption of Jefferson's Declaration, minus the slavery grievance. And I would say the nation's chances for survival improved immeasurably with the adoption of the Constitution in 1787. And once again, slavery was the dividing issue. They resolved it by protecting the slave trade for 20 years, agreeing that the earliest Congress could consider eliminating it would be 1808. So the United States was born with the original sin of slavery. And it grew strong quickly, with an economy benefiting from enslaved labor. Jefferson understood the bargain they were making with the devil. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. He trembled with good reason. The Civil War was the bloodiest war in our history. It almost destroyed the nation, and it claimed 800,000 lives. Jefferson continued to condemn slavery, but like the country, he too was dependent on it. When his father-in-law died, he inherited 100 slaves and additional plantations. He didn't find a way out of slavery for the nation or for himself. He had hoped for systemic change. He wasn't willing to suffer individually for his beliefs. To extricate himself would have meant losing his own means of support, giving up wealth, power, and influence. So we have to draw the obvious conclusion. To quote John Meacham, let us deal with slavery at the top. He failed to do the right thing, full stop, end of debate. Remember, I told you two things at the outset. He wasn't born into power, and he knew no other world but one reliant on slavery. So for the rest of his life, he accepted the evils of slavery in a compromise to advance what he considered higher priorities: the unity and growth of a fragile and young nation, and let's not forget his own personal way of life and social station. Now for our third quote, this one about Jefferson and prestige. In 1782, when Jefferson is not yet 40 years old, he receives the Marquis de Chastellux at his home. Jefferson has built this house, here's a drawing of it by then. He's named it for its site, Monticello, Little Mountain, and he designed it, as you can see, from his studies of Palladio. And Chastellux writes, Jefferson is the first American to have consulted the fine arts to know how he should shelter himself from the weather. That's high praise from a French aristocrat. Recognition of prestige and taste in a young man who has never been to Europe and has taught himself architecture so as to shelter himself from the weather. Time out for just a moment to clarify our terms. The title of this conference says Power, Prestige, and Politics. What's the difference between prestige and power? When you look them up in a dictionary, their meanings overlap quite a bit. So how are they distinct? And I think for our purposes, let's consider prestige as the way in which one might choose to express one's power and privilege, how one curates and shapes one's image and one's world to express prestige, taste, civility, or its lack. Perhaps I can best illustrate the subtle difference between power and prestige by offering a man much in the news these days, Vladimir Putin. Power? Yes, absolutely. Prestige? Prestige? Thumbs down? Thumbs down. All right. So if we make that distinction, how does Jefferson earn the praise of the Marquis de Chastellux? And as with the power he gained, it didn't come from his family, but from his education. In many ways, Jefferson was a self-made man. He didn't rise out of the gutter, to be sure, but he didn't gain it by birthright at all. He was hardly destined for national, much less international distinction. His father died when he was 14. At 16, he pleaded with his wards to let him go to college. That was not the norm for a minor planter's son in that day, but his wards agreed. He attended the second oldest university in America and the only college in Virginia, the College of William and Mary, in the capital, Williamsburg. And there he rubbed shoulders with influence, joining salons with the royal governor. But maybe more important than the royal governor was this man, his professor, Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, Dr. William Small. And it was just coincidence because Small left and returned to Scotland only a year or so after teaching Jefferson. They could have missed each other. But Small kindled Jefferson's intellect with ideas. Small kindled Jefferson's ideas and his intellect. Jefferson credited Small with probably fixing the destinies of his life. And Small probably also fixed the destiny of democracy in the modern world. He not only ignited Jefferson with ideas, of course, we know what Jefferson did with those ideas, and he inflamed Jefferson's love of books. He validated Jefferson's search for knowledge, and knowledge was the sacred flame of the Enlightenment. So instead of gambling and sporting, Jefferson used his extra money to buy books. And it was in those books that he learned and codified his ideas about architecture, landscape, farming, arts, music, and the universal rights of man. And I really think that had he found a book about how any preceding society had found a way to humanely and progressively eliminate slavery, Jefferson would have used it as a primer. Books were his tutors and his means of earning praise from the Marquis of Chastellux. Monticello, its site and design were derived from his study of books. Everything about Monticello was different. Not just the design, but the site itself. I hope you can tell, he actually carved off a mountain to create a plinth for his Palladian temple front manor. Most of his peers inherited or purchased their lands and estates. Some built their homes, but I can think of no one who so radically altered the earth to create such a setting. It's not exactly economical before mechanization to be on a mountain where all the fertile earth goes down and all the water goes down. After he had the top of the mountain carved off by his slaves, he built a small pavilion where he and his wife and then their child lived for 2 years while his enslaved laborers built Monticello. And before that house is barely begun, he looks up at this mountain next to him and decides he has to protect his viewshed and the sanctity of the world he is creating, because he doesn't want a house looking down on him, so he buys that mountain. He's been called the nation's first landscape architect. His plans were hugely ambitious among his peers, manipulating the landscape in the manner of English country houses. He created concentric driving paths down and around that mountain. He planted pleasure gardens and groves in the English tradition, and it all originates in his books. On the right is Palladio, on the left Gibbs. He called Palladio the Bible. He had 7 copies of the 4 books of Palladio. And he designed the first version of Monticello, which I showed you a moment ago, after the Villa Cornaro. But all of this was possible because he could rely on the peculiar institution of slavery. With the inheritance of his father-in-law's lands and slaves, he controlled the lives of more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children at any one time. Here's a page from his farm book in which he lists the names and dates of his enslaved people in his own hand. The 4th one down is Sally Hemings, born in 1773. And yet, he still condemns slavery in his writings. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. And then Jefferson's world and education change dramatically. In 1784, Congress sends him to Paris to assist with the peace treaty and succeed Franklin as minister to France. His wife has died in 1782. He is in a major depression, and Congress and his friends think the best thing they can do to help him get out of it is to get him to Europe. And it works. He's over the moon, writing to his friends, "Behold me at length on the vaunted scene of Europe." Finally, he gets his grand tour. Paris reinforced his ideas about the rights of man and government and the fallacy of monarchy, but it was also his degree in arts and culture. He was received at Versailles. He went to the Palais Royal and to its theater. That's for you, Brian. He watched scientific advances. He studied painting in the exhibitions at the Louvre. He discovered David and Houdon, among others. He was a sponge, not just for himself, but on behalf of the nation he had helped to found. He studied buildings. He commissioned measured drawings. He toured vineyards. He studied agriculture, all to bring back with him progressive ideas to help his country. With his passport from Louis XVI, he went on to travel in England and Italy and Germany. And he realized that prestige was critical to his young nation. More than any of the other American founders, he understood that the arts were one of the essential criteria by which a new nation would be judged. If the United States were to succeed, it had to prove that its experimental form of government could embrace and nurture a rich civilization. In 1785, he writes to his friend James Madison with what I consider to be his manifesto on the importance of the arts. You see, I am an enthusiast on the subject of the arts, but it is enthusiasm of which I am not ashamed, as its object is to improve the taste of my countrymen, to increase their reputation, to reconcile to them the respect of the world, and procure them its praise. Let's unpack that a bit. To improve the taste of my countrymen. Well, Jefferson is the populist among the founders, believing that all men are equal and that with education they are capable of governing themselves. That actually wasn't a unanimous opinion among the founders, and in fact, Washington very nearly became king had Adams and Hamilton had their way. The arts have throughout history, and as we've seen in this conference, been the bastion of the rich and powerful, monarchies, papacies, empires. In Jefferson's time, there was no regard for folk art or outsider art, and he realized that if the common man were to replace monarchies and dictators in government, then they also had to step up to take a role in the arts and in expressing the values and tastes of a civilization. That's kind of a hill to climb. Next, to increase their reputation. Well, he's spelling it out here. Reputation for what? For education, taste, refinement. He knew Americans would be reviled as commoners, middle class, at best. And he knew the arts were the best weapon to prove them otherwise. Next, to reconcile to them the respect of the world. Here it is. He's in Paris writing this, facing the prejudices he knows will impede his own country if they cannot prove that a democracy does not mean the starvation of the arts. And last, and maybe most aspirationally, procure them its praise. This is Jefferson, the dreamer, the visionary, the optimist, the seer for a future. It would take until the mid-20th century, post-World War II, for the arts in America to turn the heads of Europeans. But Jefferson knew that it must be put in motion. As an ambassador, he rents this house here in the Champs-Élysées at the city gates. He had to pay to furnish it himself. Congress didn't have enough money. He buys books, sculptures, prints, scientific instruments, maps, copies of famous paintings, furnishings, textiles, silver, porcelains, and even French copper cookwares. He pronounced Udall the greatest artist of the age and arranged commissions of portraits of the American founders, including himself. When he was called back to the United States in 1789, after 5 years in Paris, you would have expected he might have sold all this to recoup his expenses. But no, he shipped 87 crates back to Monticello from Paris. It was called the monstrous packing list. And you know how he paid for it? Remember those diplomatic gifts? Well, he didn't get 480 diamonds, was it, with Franklin's Bois à portrait? He was given by Louis XVI a miniature portrait with brilliants, meaning diamonds. But unfortunately, the king sent it over after he'd left, so it was delivered to his house, so he had his secretary handle it, and you guessed it, the diamonds got sold to pay for this. The reason he sent all of this back to Monticello because he was now preparing to shape his own image. He was focusing on his prestige and that of the nation. He wanted to recreate his world with the knowledge and taste he had gained in Europe. He wanted to secure his reputation as a man of education, taste, ideas, and progress. He returned home and immediately tore down and rebuilt Monticello. It becomes his autobiography, his laboratory, his tutorial for peers and posterity on the role of the arts. No other American founder created such a statement for themselves as Jefferson did at Monticello. He modeled the second Monticello on one of the newest neoclassical buildings in Paris, not one of the most traditional, the Hotel de Salm, now of course the home of the French Legion of Honor. And it was one of the first domestic buildings in Paris to have a dome. Jefferson went daily to watch its construction, sitting along the Seine and watching it. His second Monticello had no precedent. No home in America had such light-filled rooms, much less a dome, skylights, floor-to-ceiling sash windows, French doors for entry, parquet floors, entablature derived from Roman temples. He freely acknowledged that his neighbors called it the curiosity of the neighborhood. It was an outrageously bold and ambitious statement of his newly gained prestige. And like the first Monticello, it was possible because of humans he held in bondage. His livelihood and his lifestyle were utterly and completely dependent on men and women like Isaac Granger Jefferson. Black children who shaped the bricks for the walls of his house, leaving their fingerprints in the soft clay. Children who lived with families of 6 or 8 or more in cabins like these. Jefferson was no different than the nation, and he knew it. And he understood perhaps more than most how fragile the nation was and the increasing peril that slavery posed. In 1820, he wrote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, self-preservation in the other." Self-preservation versus justice. I think it's hard for any of us to understand that choice today, but maybe we're not so far from it. Climate change might be the closest analogy. I think most of us know what it would take, what we know to be right, and we also have the comforts and the economy of our lives in the other scale. So for the last part of my time with you, I want to walk through Monticello, for it is a most unusual expression of power, prestige, and the peculiar institution of slavery. And the through line, the theme that it expresses, is relentless dedication to knowledge, not patrimony, not aristocracy, but the potential for human progress. Monticello is Jefferson's autobiography. John Meacham says it's the closest you can come to having a conversation with him is to go to Monticello. There is intention in every detail. It embodies his devotion to learning and curiosity as the surest path to human progress. Because for Jefferson, knowledge was the great hope for mankind. So when you enter the front hall, you encounter a very strange array of artifacts. Fossils of a mastodon there on the left, busts of Voltaire and Turgot flanking the entry, European paintings, maps, Native American artifacts. Instead of family portraits or aristocracy, Jefferson offers the patrimony of human history and civilizations. The Indian artifacts would have been crazy bizarre to any guests who entered. I mean, these look somewhat familiar to us today, but nobody had been out west with until Lewis and Clark went to send these things back to Jefferson. Nor would they have seen game specimens like this. When President Hollande came and he walked into the front hall with Barack Obama, he asked me if Jefferson was a hunter. And I said, oh, no, that's from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Nowhere in the country would you have found a Roman sculpture of Ariadne juxtaposed with a pre-Columbian figure. This is Jefferson's own eccentric form of Wunderkammer, a strange and bizarre assemblage. It was really his museum, installed in his entry hall where the most visitors could see it and learn from it. So next, let's go to the source of Jefferson's knowledge, his office, his cabinet, his library. Here's the power behind his prestige in politics. And remember that the library is the crucible of the Enlightenment, which asserts that progress is not divinely administered, but scientifically gained, arduously, with every advancement of knowledge. And Jefferson even had a death mask of Oliver Cromwell. Book by book, Jefferson created the largest library on the continent. And when the British burned Washington in 1814, including the Capitol and its library of 3,000 volumes, Jefferson acted on his duty of care and devotion and offered his library to Congress for whatever price they wished to establish. He collected it over 50 years. And when presented with that bargain purchase, there were still congressmen who scoffed at the idea. Why do we need books in all these languages? Jefferson could read 7 languages. And why do we need all these different topics? And Jefferson famously responded, I do not know that it contains any branch of science which Congress would wish to exclude from their collection. There's in fact no subject to which a member of Congress may not have occasion to refer. But here's the most important part. My desire is either to place it in their hands entire or to preserve it here. All or nothing. And so Jefferson established the unlimited parameters that have made the Library of Congress the most expansive of any in the world. Here you see how they honor the heart and soul of that library, which now numbers 173 million items, including 51 million books in 470 languages. But as the wagons left Monticello with his books, Jefferson famously lamented to John Adams, I cannot live without books. So he begins buying more. For Jefferson, books were also a marketplace of ideas. In the privacy and sanctum sanctorum of his cabinet, he could retreat, read, study, think, and write. He was part of an international republic of letters that included Alexander von Humboldt, Tsar Alexander, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the Marquis de Lafayette, Joseph Priestley, to name a few. And from these rooms, Jefferson wrote 18,000 letters, most using this apparatus, which he called a polygraph, which generated a copy. And he efficiently positioned his bed between his office and his chamber. But guests were not invited into these private rooms. From the entry hall, they entered the parlor, a remarkably light-filled room that seems at first conventional. Portraits, music, huge looking glasses that had been shipped from France. But then your impression changes because the portraits are not of Jefferson's family. Again, this is human history, the Enlightenment. These portraits are about those topics and the revolution and the advancement of knowledge. He gave pride of place to these, his 3 heroes. He called them the 3 greatest men who ever lived: Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, and John Locke. Science, philosophy. He also displayed portraits of the discovering explorers: Columbus, Magellan, Sir Francis Drake. And you see there the Marquis de Lafayette, part of his series that also included George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. The parquet floor, like the dome and the skylights and the floor-to-ceiling windows, it was the first parquet floor in America. And equally unusual were the scientific instruments, like this vacuum pump, or the Sèvres porcelain bisque figures on tabletops or mantels with French clocks. From the parlor, you might be invited into the dining room for dinner. Jefferson had learned the art of the power dinner party in Paris, which was, of course, on the eve of the French Revolution. He understood how politics could change with a meal. And his dining room was outfitted with privacy for conversations of intellect and advancement. He installed a dumbwaiter system in the sides of the fireplace so that wine could be pulled up, hoisted up from below, from the wine cellar below, without the servants and their ears. Off the dining room was the tea room or breakfast room, a truly indoor-outdoor room, with Jefferson's worthies, again, not his family, these all sculpted by Houdon. Here you see Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and John Paul Jones, all heroes in the American canon, not his ancestors, but those of a nation. And ironically, very few saw Jefferson's pièce de résistance, the dome room, one of the most notable of his architectural achievements, the first on any house in America. It's his PhD dissertation in architecture. And that was it. That was its purpose. He never really furnished it. It was used for storage and delight. If you took a guest up there, if you've been to Monticello, the little staircases are like lighthouses. You couldn't even get furniture up those staircases to furnish this room if you'd wanted to. So the empty dome room is maybe a metaphor for unfulfilled vision, as was America, as was the Declaration of Independence. But he built it anyways, just as he wrote the Declaration, knowing its purpose could not be fulfilled in his lifetime, but believing that with human progress, human rights and equality would be realized. So I hope I've demonstrated that Jefferson amassed power, prestige, and influence by virtue of his education, his ideas, but all empowered by the peculiar institution of slavery. He was more interested in securing the power and future of the American experiment than abolishing slavery or amassing or wielding personal power. During his 8 years as our third president, he used his power to advance the nation considerably. He commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the West before he legally could do that. The Louisiana Purchase came just as the expedition was actually commissioned and leaving. And here you see the black line right there is really our border with Canada. So you can see how the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country with a stroke of a pen. And in 1807, he petitioned Congress to effect the end of the slave trade, the instant that the legislative moratorium would expire on January of 1808, and they did. And you don't have to read all this, and I'm not going to read it for you, but this is his letter of excitement that this has been ended. But the most maybe important part is right here. I sincerely pray with you, my friends, that all members of the human family may, in time prescribed by the Father of us all, find themselves securely established in the enjoyments of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He had given up on ending slavery, and he consigned it in passive voice to the Almighty. And he said as much 2 years earlier, in 1805, I've long since given up the expectation of any early provision for the extinguishment of slavery amongst us. There are many virtuous men who would make any sacrifice to effect it, many equally virtuous who persuade themselves either that the thing is not wrong or that it cannot be remedied. I think he wants the reader to think he is among the former, but his actions suggest he's actually among the latter. Thomas Jefferson spent 40 years in public office, most of them away from Monticello. His plantation was not well managed in his absence. He died in ruinous debt. Over the course of his lifetime, he owned 607 human beings and freed only 11, 4 of them his own children with Sally Hemings. Upon his death, the slaves, of course, had to be sold. To settle his debts, the families were divided. In the last 30 years, Monticello has spent untold resources and time, traveling and finding the descendants of those slaves, reuniting them and getting their stories. Jefferson's personal wealth and prestige were waning in those final years of his, but not his legacy to the country. And even his role in the arts was drawing recognition. This is Benjamin Latrobe, who designed the US Capitol, writing to him that it's no flattery to say that you have planted the arts in your country. The works already erected in this city are the monuments of your judgment and of your zeal and of your taste. In 1819, at the age of 76, Jefferson embarked on his last public project, the creation of a truly public university without any religious affiliation. Believing that religion was a private matter between every man and his God, Jefferson resisted state religion and is responsible for the separation of church and state in our Bill of Rights. So it followed that he also wanted to separate religion from education, to banish any form of tyranny over the human mind, a quote of his. He also believed that for citizens to govern themselves in a democracy, they must have access to public education. So he devoted his final years to establishing the first non-sectarian college in our country, the University of Virginia. He designed its buildings, hired its faculty, selected its library, served as its rector, and where a chapel would have been at any other campus, this is his temple of knowledge, the library. I think he is perhaps the only head of state ever to have been so deeply engaged in the creation of a university. It was completed in 1825, built almost entirely by enslaved laborers, some of them belonging to Jefferson. And in that same year, Jefferson continued to pen his opposition to slavery. The abolition of the evil is not impossible. It ought never, therefore, to be despaired of. Every plan should be adopted, every experiment tried which may do something towards the ultimate object. But these have become empty words. And this is 11 months before his death. Jefferson failed us on slavery, full stop. But he did not fail us with the Declaration of Independence. He died on the 50th anniversary of that world-changing document on July 4th, 1826. The power of the rights of man has been invoked around the world by freedom fighters everywhere. And so I will end with another quote about power, penned by British poet Percy Shelley, about the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, called Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And what were Jefferson's words for posterity? He designed his own tombstone, and he mentioned none of his positions of power, not president, vice president, minister to France, secretary of state. He wanted only to be remembered for 3 things, 3 ideas that advanced human progress. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Unlike Ozymandias, Jefferson knew that kingdoms were fragile, ideas were power. Thank you.